Of Jesus, sing His mercy and His grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, He'll prepare for us a place. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. While we walk the pilgrim pathway, clouds will overspread the sky. But when traveling days are over, not a shadow, not a sigh. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. Let us then be true and faithful, trusting, serving every day. Just one glimpse of Him in glory will the toils of life repay. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. As I sang this song this week preparing for tonight, I could actually hear Paul as he went through all of his journeys and would go to different churches, talk to people down by the river, talk to individuals that were doing their job, a jailer, and he would actually, no doubt, talk about what it meant when people get to heaven. I think so. His main goal was to preach the gospel for what outcome? For people to get to heaven. That was his main goal. So I'm sure, and we can see in some of the writings that he talks about to some of the churches and some of the other epistles that he wrote, that he does focus on heaven, the kingdom of heaven, and what it means that it's going to be like when we get there. So I like this song because it helps us to remember heaven and the promise that we have of heaven. Tonight we are in Acts chapter 22. Acts chapter 22. You'll recall last week that we ended up that Paul had been sent to Jerusalem because of the money that he had been collecting throughout his 3 missionary journeys. We also know from Scriptures that at each town that Paul was at, the Spirit would tell him what to expect when he got to Jerusalem. Most of his friends in each of these towns also reminded him and pleaded with him not to go to Jerusalem because they knew what the outcome of that would be. Paul still set his sights on Jerusalem because he knew that God's plan was for him to go to Jerusalem. We know that. Every time that Paul would be troubled or afraid, the Lord would come and stand beside him, and we're going to see that tonight. And the Lord would encourage him by telling him that he had a plan for him, whether it was to go this way or that way or to go to Jerusalem. So Paul set his sights on Jerusalem, and nothing was going to delay him getting there. No jail cell, no threat of death, no stone that would be thrown at him to make people think that he was dead on the road. He was dead set on going to Jerusalem to talk to people about Jesus. That's amazing, isn't it? That he was so dedicated and his mind was focused on one thing and one thing only. Is preaching the Word of God and fulfilling God's plan wherever that may be. We see him go to Jerusalem last week, and we see the prophets were right, the spirits were true, the friends were correct in saying when you get to Jerusalem, bad things are going to happen to you. And they did. He was overwhelmed by the crowd. And beyond that, the elders that were there in Jerusalem tried to convince Paul to take an oath and to shave his head and to become ceremonial clean so that the Jews that were in the town of Jerusalem wouldn't believe the rumors that were spread about Paul, that he was denying the law of Moses, that he was, in fact, teaching against the law of Moses. And you remember last week that we had some discussion about what Paul did in obeying. He became ceremonially unclean, but the mob overtook him before he could offer sacrifices. Now, we had a discussion last week with Paul. Would he have went ahead and did the blood sacrifices? And we don't have to answer that because God made it possible that he never was put in that situation to do that. But he was ceremonial clean. And we're going to see that tonight also. After the crowd gathered around him, it was such an overwhelming thing that the Roman guards decided that they were going to take him, put him on his shoulders, and they were going to take him into the barracks away from the crowd. But before they could get into the barracks, Paul whispers into the centurion's ear and he asks, "Can I say something to the crowd?" And last week we saw the sermon that Paul preached on those steps. He talked about his own life. He said, in fact, I know how you're feeling because I was the same way you were. I was the same place you're at. So I know how you're feeling. Let me tell you my story. Let me tell you what I did. How I persecuted the Christians. How I was a Jew above all Jews. And how the sight of Jesus and the resurrection that was so obvious to me, and the promise that was given to me, and the command that was given to me, changed my life. And after he talked about that, they became even more agitated because he talked about the resurrection of Jesus. So they did take him into the barracks. And in verse 27, the commander here, the commander went to Paul and asked, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" "Yes, I am," he answered. So now again, Paul was being abused. He was being chained. He was being put in prison. And these were things that did not happen to Roman citizens. If you were a Roman citizen, there were some privileges that you got. Almost like we as Americans, the privilege that we have. If we are accused, we get the right to go before our accuser. We get the right to be judged by our peers. We get the right to, if necessary, to go before the grand jury. And that's the privilege that was offered to Paul at this particular time. And the commander realized this. So he goes to Paul and he says, "Is it true? Are you really a Roman citizen?" And Paul says, "Yes, I am." Verse 28, then the commander said, "I had to pay a big price for my citizenship. But I was born a citizen," Paul replied. Those who were about to question him withdrew immediately. The commander himself was alarmed when he realized that he had put Paul, a Roman citizen, in chains. So now we see very clearly here Paul using this opportunity to tell people that he's a Roman citizen. Now, has he been beaten before? Has he been jailed before? Why hasn't he used this ace card before? He could have used that ace card in any of the times that he was being persecuted and chained and jailed and beaten, and it would have been the same result that we see here. They would have backed off. Why do you think it was different here? Why did Paul use his citizenship card here? Okay, but we know that Paul wasn't afraid of death. We do know that Paul later on would say, if I die, it's to my credit, but if I live, it's to God's credit. So we know he wasn't afraid of death. So why didn't he? Yes. He wanted to talk to a crowd. Okay. You're right on track. The reason that he didn't do it when he did it with the jailer, because what did the scene of the jailer produce? If he would have showed his card before he was put in jail and walked free, the jailer would have never heard him singing. The jailer would never have taken him to his house. Him and his family would never have been baptized. And we can see that on each occasion, Paul uses every situation to glorify God. And on this particular situation, he uses his citizenship card to glorify God. He never glorifies himself. He's put in chain and he's beaten. And he could be silent and not say anything. But now he speaks up, because with him speaking up, we're going to see later on, he's going to be able to do great things, not only in Jerusalem, but also in Rome. Those who were examining him in verse 29, they were scared to death because they knew the rights of the Roman citizen. And they knew what would happen if somebody didn't obey those rights and rules. They would also be put in chains. They also would be put in prison. So those who examined them immediately withdrew because they realized that Paul was a Roman citizen. So Paul is in chains. He's been beaten. They realize he's a Roman citizen, but he's still in jail. He's still being kept because of the crowd. Now, in verse 30, 30's not in there, but look at verse 30, if you got your Bibles with you. The next day, since the commander wanted to find out exactly why Paul was being accused by the Jews, he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the Sanhedrin to assemble. Then he brought Paul and had him stand before them. Now, with the Sanhedrin, they were an honest group of people, right? Upstanding citizens. And they were going to do what was right? No, we know that. We've got proof of that. They hated Paul, didn't they? Man, they wanted him dead. We're going to see that even more tonight if we get there, because they devised a plot to try to get rid of him finally, to kill him. So now the commander goes to the enemy and says, y'all come together and let's figure out what's going on with Paul. Now, does the Sanhedrin know what's going on with Paul? They do. They know exactly what Paul's been doing. They know what he's been preaching all over that area, all over that part of the world. So they're very familiar. So now the commander is taking Paul to be faced by his accusers who hate him. You think Paul has a chance? Look at verse 20, chapter 23 now. Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and said, my brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day. Now I like this scene too. Paul's never backed down from a fight, has he? He's very bold. Maybe sometimes not to his advantage, but he's always trying to think what's right. So now he stands before the Sanhedrin and he looks them square in the eye. This is the same Sanhedrin 15 to 20 years ago that had handed Saul papers to go to Damascus to get rid of the Christians once and for all. So now he looks dead at these people that gave them that order, and he says, I haven't failed to carry out my commitment. Oh, yeah. They hated him. Yeah. Yeah. They hated him. Because where Paul is at, and this is amazing, where Paul is standing at this moment is the same place that Jesus stood. It's the same place that Peter and John stood. And it's probably close to the same place where Stephen stood. Where the Sanhedrin tried their hardest all those years back to convict Jesus, to try to get John the Baptist to stop preaching, or not John the Baptist, but Peter and John to stop preaching. So this is the same spot that all these individuals were at. Paul is standing before the Sanhedrin, and he looks straight at him, and he says, in all good conscience, I've done my duty. Now, when you look at somebody, especially if you're trying to answer or trying to convince somebody, and you look them dead in the eye, they know you're talking to them, right? They know you're not talking about somebody else. So he's looking at them, and he says, I've carried out my duty. And he's looking at them. Verse 2 says, at this the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. Why did Ananias strike him? Because in his mind, Paul just told a lie. In his mind, he had not carried out his duty. What was his duty as Saul? To kill him. Now he's done the opposite. He has grown the movement by leaps and bounds, hasn't he? They're going to say in a minute, this guy has caused trouble all over the world. And boy, what a statement that is for Paul, isn't it? Good job, Paul. And now we see Paul looking at the Sanhedrin and saying, I've finished and I've completed my duty with a clear conscience, and the Sadducees and the Sanhedrin cannot stand it, and they strike him. Yes, Don. That's right. Yeah. But the Sanhedrin didn't understand the idea that he was talking about God or themselves. He knew when he said that he was going to cause trouble. No doubt about it. We're going to see that in a minute because he stirs up the trouble to make a point. Verse 3 says, then Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there and judge me according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck. Again, he's talking about the law of the Roman citizen. That a Roman citizen can't be struck, can't be chained, can't be imprisoned until he goes through the legal system. So he looks at him, he tells him, I've done my duty. He's struck, and then Paul comes back and says, you guys are whitewashed walls. Don?
Was not to punish someone before being heard.
Yeah. No doubt on that too. But we know that he's referring to, because he's already claimed that he's using his Roman citizenship. He's not talking about the law of Moses here. Well, at this moment, we're going to see, continue in the context, he talks about his Roman citizenship. Now, he could very easily be the Moses law, because that's true too. And he is talking to the Sanhedrin, so that's a very good possibility. Either way, whether it was a Roman citizen or the law of Moses, not to strike until you get the right evidence. So, yeah, I can see what you're saying. But the context here is the Roman citizen that he's talked about so far. And verse 3, when he talks about the whitewashed walls, do y'all understand what that represents? Whitewashed tombs, yeah. Tombs, when he talked about the bones behind the tombs, even though the tomb's pretty. But on this particular occasion, a wall that has cracks in it. If you've ever went into a home that has plaster and is terribly cracked, you put a couple of coats of paint on it, it looks like it's fine. You don't see the cracks. You don't see the defaults that are in the wall. It looks like it's fine. Paul would use this reference to show that the cracking of the Jewish law was almost over with. The crumbling was almost over with, and they're a whitewashed, using the whitewash to cover up what's going on. Verse 4, those who were standing near Paul said, "You dare to insult God's high priest." Paul replied, "Brothers, I did not realize that he was a high priest. For it is written, 'Do not speak evil about the rule of your people,'" the rulers of your people. Again, as Don pointed out, referring to the law of Moses here. And then, when Paul hears that, verse 6, then Paul, knowing that some of them, let's look at 5 a little bit longer. After Paul hears that, he goes back and he almost apologizes. Is that normal for Paul to apologize? Have we ever heard Paul apologizing before? Did Paul need to apologize? Yes, Daniel.
Do you think it could also be a backhanded comment to them because they spoke evil of Caesar all the time? I mean,
It's possible.
historically speaking, the Jews did not like the Roman rulers. So that's the reason I asked.
Yeah, it could have been. Who knows? But I think that he was being genuine and serious here when he said, "I didn't know he was a high priest." But on the other hand, how could he not know he was a high priest? Where was he at? Yeah, he was in Jerusalem. They're in Jerusalem now. Yes.
That's where he was in prison?
He's in Jerusalem. He's in the Sanhedrin.
He's been away for 20 years?
He's been away for 20 years, so they could have changed. The high priest, they had the garb on to show that they were a high priest. Maybe he didn't have the garb on, the hat and all the clothes.
May have been bad eyesight.
That's another conclusion that some writers have said, that he couldn't see very well. Jeff?
In Paul's perspective, he doesn't need to recognize this human as the high priest. He has a different high priesthood.
That's true. But we see here, he does acknowledge, because he almost apologizes when he says, "I'm sorry. I didn't realize I was talking to the high priest because of what the law of Moses said." So, Paul uses every situation so that he will glorify God. We know that. Whether it's using his card, a citizenship card, or whether it's being silent. He uses every situation to glorify God. So, this particular situation, he is using his apology, whether it's sincere or not, to prove a point. When the high priest heard him apologize, what did that make the high priest do? Did he become more agitated, or did he back off? When somebody tells you that has hurt you, "Oh, I'm sorry that I hurt you," your defenses kind of go down, don't they? But on the other hand, if they never say they're sorry, but keep arguing, you keep putting up defenses, right? Now, Paul, at this moment, whether he needed to or not, apologizes, and now things maybe have been cooled down for a moment. So Paul was doing that to bring the high priest up?
I'm not saying he did that for that reason, but it could cause that high priest.
Oh, yes. Yeah, no doubt. Eddie?
Breaking any of the laws of the old law, he would have played right into their hands. That's what they were accusing him of anyway. So by apologizing and recognizing that, he's basically calling them out of the law, not playing into their hands.
Absolutely. I think so too. Don?
He's making the case that he's still doing
else have? Nobody had it. You have a comment? Okay.
He was also saying that he knew the law,
Yeah, we know that.
and he's telling them that he knew the law. He wasn't just a rabble-rousing Christian. He was a scholar in the law.
No doubt about that. He's going to use that to his defense here in a moment too, as he's done on a number of occasions to show that he's fulfilled the law. When other people would be spreading rumors about him doing the opposite, he would prove that he actually wasn't. And again, this could be one of those occasions too when he does that. So, after he apologizes, and again, whatever reason why he apologized, maybe things cooled down, now Paul has the opportunity again to make a statement that would cause the individuals to start fighting amongst themselves. So they've turned away from Paul, and now they're focusing on themselves. Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, called out in the Sanhedrin, "My brothers, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. I stand on trial because of my hope in the resurrection of the dead." Now, we all know the difference between a Sadducee and a Pharisee. Sadducee did not believe, in fact, you'll see there the description in verse 7. When he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say that there's no resurrection and that there are neither angels nor spirits, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. So, the statement that Paul made when he is standing before the Sanhedrin, he doesn't say anything about the resurrection of Jesus. He talks about the resurrection of the dead. And the Sadducees, which did not believe the New Testament or the Gospels yet, but they did believe in the Old Testament, talking about the Messiah and the resurrection from the dead. So now Paul uses his knowledge of the Old Testament to cause friction between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, because the Pharisees believed in the resurrection of the dead through the old law, but the Sadducees did not. They didn't believe in angels. They didn't believe in spirits. And isn't that odd? The Sadducees were the main group that ran the Sanhedrin, if you look back at your history. Isn't that scary? We've always heard of Sadducees and Pharisees, right? As a young child, I heard about the Pharisees and Sadducees my whole life. But now we understand that what the Sadducees believed in, they were the working force of the whole Sanhedrin. They were the ones that made the rules. The Pharisees were a group, but the Sadducees outnumbered them. So now we can see why and how could a group of Jewish believers not believe in the resurrection of the dead when the Old Testament pointed to that. That's a good question. I don't know. I'll have to look that up. I think somewhere in time, and again, I don't know if there's a particular time where we can see that, where they broke off. I can't answer that right now. But that's a good question. But we do know that there has been that group. Daniel, do you have an idea on that? Malachi and Matthew. Yeah. Yeah, again, I'm not sure. Maccabees is uninspired, and Josephus is uninspired, and you can look at that. But to go to Scriptures and say when did they do it, I don't know if we can really tell or not. In the New Testament, there was that split between the Pharisees and Sadducees. But that is a good question to ask, and I will look that up this week. And so can you, please do that. Everybody, if you want to do that, Don. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Well, if you want a good study this week, look up Sadducees and Pharisees and see the difference. It helped me in reading the difference between the two. But we do know there was a split. One believed in the resurrection, another one did not. And Paul used that to his advantage. Verse 8, the Sadducees say that there's no resurrection, neither the angels nor demons, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. There was a great uproar, and some of the teachers of the law who were Pharisees stood up and argued vigorously. We find nothing wrong with this man, they said. What if a spirit or angel has spoken to him? The dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them. He ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. So, Paul used the advantage that he saw before him to cause a disruption. And it did take it away from him for a moment, didn't it? To the point where they were fighting against each other. Don? Oh, yeah. Yeah, with Paul just bringing in the idea of that, of resurrection. He brought it in. And then the Pharisees, added that. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, no doubt. So there was a great uproar, and we see the very clear providential care of God here. What was Paul being brought before the Sanhedrin for? You remember? Tearing down the law, spitting on Moses, doing everything that the law says and going against the law. Well, did they prove that? Have they proved that yet? That he did that? No. So, the Sadducees, the Sanhedrin couldn't prove it, so what'd they do? If a bully or somebody can't prove something, what do they usually do? You hit. You hit them. And that's what they did. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Sanhedrin could not prove the false accusations against Paul. So they became so overwhelmed with their emotions, and they hit Paul. And we know here in verse 11, Paul has been beaten by the crowd. Yes, Dale?
Tearing down the law and everything, when he said it is written that you shall not speak ill of your rulers, then he was going back and showing them that he believed in the law according to what they said. So that kind of shot him out of the water, didn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, everything that Paul proved, they did not have a defense against any of that.
Mark, you said about the high priest, which he may have tried to get a rise out of the high priest, and then we could say the high priest is violating the law, not me.
Yeah, and he did. He showed that, yeah. Yeah, that's true. So we've seen so far Paul coming to Jerusalem. What's happened to Paul? He's been beaten by the mob. He's been thrown in prison. He's been chained, but released. From chains anyway. Still in prison. we know that all along Paul's missionary journeys, the Spirit has come and stood beside Paul on 2 occasions and said, take courage, just as you've testified about me, you're going to go to Jerusalem. So Paul has always known where he's going. Paul has always known he's going to wind up in Jerusalem because that's all that he's been told. He went through all his missionary journeys, the Spirit always convicting him and telling him, you're going to go and preach in Jerusalem. The Spirit never promised that he would have comfort. The Spirit never promised that he would be rich. The Spirit never even promised him he would have success. He just said, you're going to go to Jerusalem. Now the success would be God working on the hearts. All Paul's job is to preach. So now he's in Jerusalem. He's in jail in Jerusalem. The Spirit has said nothing about what happens after Jerusalem until verse 11. Paul is in jail. He's been beaten. He's probably discouraged. He's overwhelmed because he's in jail. He came to Jerusalem hoping to talk to individuals, mainly the Jews, about Jesus. And what do? They don't want anything to do with Jesus. So he must be discouraged about that. Must be weary. Where do I go from here? I don't have any. I don't know if I'm going to get out, if I'm going to be killed. What's going to happen to me? The following night, the Lord stood near Paul. Take courage, as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome. Do you think that encouraged an individual that had been beaten, that was in jail, that didn't know what his future held for him? Now, the Lord stood before him and said, you get to go to Rome. And oh, by the way, it's going to be on a superhighway that the Roman nation has built. You're going to go first class all the way to Rome. Paul was still beaten. Paul was still in prison in the barracks. He was still weary, but his heart must have beat with excitement, don't you know? Now he got the rest of the story. He was going to Rome. Now, Rome was so important to Paul because if you remember, Paul tried to stop at every town that had significance in the region. All the ports he stopped at were significant. And oh, by the way, all those ports were run by who? By Rome. He hadn't been to the main one yet. He hadn't gone there yet. Now, all of a sudden, when he looked at maybe all hope was gone, he didn't know what to expect. The Lord stood beside him, and it must have rekindled Paul's hope. In fact, I know it did, because it said, take courage. So, the Lord would not have used these words, take courage, if he was lacking courage, right? If he had courage, the Lord would have said, keep your courage. What does he say? He says, take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify to me in Rome. Again, the 2 times that we've looked at were in Acts chapter 18, which I believe Dan talked about when he talked on that Wednesday night. And then the last one was a couple of weeks ago in Acts chapter 22, when the Lord stood beside Paul and encouraged him. So, what wonderful words these were for Paul to hear. Don?
The statement Paul made earlier about being a Roman citizen helped him get out of that Sanhedrin when it turned to a mob, because the chief captain was still responsible for him and still worried about him being a Roman citizen.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, no doubt. That was his job. Yeah, I agree. So, in closing tonight, has anybody ever needed to be encouraged? Sure, we all have. Have you ever been beat down and wondering where your next step is going to be? What's going to happen tomorrow? Now, the Lord's not going to appear before us like He did Paul, but we still can be encouraged by His words, can't we? He has promised us that He has a plan for us. Paul always knew that he had a plan. Now he knows for sure where that plan is going to take him to and where he's going to wind up with. We always don't know what our plan is, but we do know that the man that made the plan knows what he's doing, right? And even though we still may be beaten, we still may be discouraged, we can be rekindled by the promises that God gave us. Because the same God that stood beside Paul is the same God that stands beside us today. Isn't that wonderful? Let's remember that this week. Let's bow for a word of prayer and we'll be dismissed. Dear Heavenly Father, we come to close of this service thanking you so much for all that you've done for us. We thank you for that in times of trouble, as Paul did, we can be encouraged by your presence through your word. We ask that you be with us through the continuation of this week, that you give us the courage that we need to be the kind of Christians that are necessary in this world of darkness. Thank you for all you've done for us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.